Hey AP Eagles, back here to finish week 2 of our AP review. Remember, only one full week left before your AP exam on May 15th. Next week we'll be jumping into Unit 5 and Unit 6, and then finally finishing the beginning of the following week with Unit 7, and that's where we're going to end and be down to those last few days before the exam. So let's not waste any time. We got pages 14 and 15 today to go through in your AP review notebook. As a side note, if I had to guess, I think that the topics at the end of Unit 4 through Unit 5 and 6 are the most likely units for the College Board to pick their DBQ essay to be about. So I guess what I'm saying is I think these next couple topics that we're going to be covering starting today and going through next week, those are going to be the topics that I would really focus my energy on. I don't know, I just have this feeling. I feel like the early 1800s to the late 1800s, I feel like that's the chunk of time that they're going to pick from when they decide on the topic of the DBQ essay this year. So just kind of keep that in mind as you guys are going through this. I might be wrong, but just sort of a gut feeling there. All right. We're on page 14. All right. Page 14 is the Second Great Awakening and the Age of Reforms. Now, again, I think this is a perfect topic for the DBQ essay to be on May 15th. So let's jump right into that. The Second Great Awakening, if you guys remember, that was a religious movement, and it followed the First Great Awakening, which was well before this, right, in the early 1700s, before the American Revolution. This religious movement, the Second Great Awakening, has sort of a similar theme to it. It starts as a religious movement, this time in the South, and the message of the religious movement, and it comes from guys like Lyman Beecher and Charles G. Finney. All right, those are some of the preachers. These guys are talking about reviving Protestantism. Okay. Again, it goes back to that idea that religion had sort of become stale and stagnant, and these preachers are looking to revive religion and make people excited again about not only religion, but about the idea of people having the ability to positively impact their own lives. And if there are things in society that are immoral or dangerous, people have the ability to act, and that's their message. You can do something to improve your life, to improve society, to make America better. So it starts as a religious movement, but ultimately starts to feed into more of a social movement. Now what it does is it starts in the South and it moves north. And as it moves north is when it transitions from that religious movement to more of a social reform movement, because as it gets to the north, a lot of specifically white middle class Americans are going to take that message of changing America, making America better, right? Making it more moral and fixing some of the injustices. So that's where the Second Great Awakening will sort of lead into these age of reforms, right, of the Jackson era. So on your review sheet, there are a sort of a general list, but there's more than this, right? When we're talking about the age of reformers, we already said that mainly middle-class white Americans. Women will take an active role in the reforms of this time period as well. As far as the focus of these reformers, you could put a more general answer and say any sort of social injustices or social ills that needed to be fixed. But we can just sort of go down the list real quick, right? When you're talking about this, the Second Great Awakening leading to social reforms, you're probably going to start with the temperance movement. Remember, the temperance was an anti-alcohol, anti-hard liquor movement. And we see organizations being formed to try to combat the evils of hard liquor. Remember, the focus of the temperance society and these organizations of the time was that alcohol abuse was dangerous for families, and it was bad for families. And alcohol abuse was immoral, and it leads to additional immoral behaviors and gambling and swearing and those types of things. So the temperance movement, led by Lyman Beecher, one of the preachers of the Second Great Awakening, is going to look to sort of put pressure on Americans to limit their alcohol consumption. Remember, we said that this one actually was fairly successful. If you look at the time period, alcohol consumption dropped by about 50%. So that's a pretty successful movement, all right? But some of the other movements of the time period that aren't specifically listed in the review questions that I gave you. Don't forget, reform in public education. You have a reformer like Horace Mann. And Horace Mann is going to promote this concept of free public education, something where that hadn't existed in the past, right? Education had always sort of been for the wealthy and middle class families that could afford it. And what Horace Mann said is basically every child should have the opportunity at education. Okay, another movement of the time period, remember that cult of domesticity. We've been talking about how there's been these women's movements throughout US history. And the cult of domesticity during this time period is sort of another piece of that. Now remember, the cult of domesticity was not promoting women's rights, but more the idea of a greater respect for women for what they do in the household and the raising of children. And this is the time period where women are going to be seen as the perfect people to be educators, to be teachers, all right? And that shows that people are starting to respect women more as the people that are in charge of raising children and teaching them morals and those types of things. We talked about the utopian movement, if you remember that, right? The idea of creating these perfect societies. Ultimately, never really panned out, but another concept and movement of the time period. We talked about transcendentalism. Remember those authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau promoting that idea of living simply, living peacefully, respecting life around you. Was more of a anti-government, anti-taxes, anti-slavery, anti-war, anti-possessions and technology and those types of things, okay? Some of the bigger movements of the time period, though, I should give you one more. Don't forget Dorothea Dix, right, in the asylum and prison movement. Her goal of reforming asylums and prisons because they had become these places where you basically took people and you threw them away forever and they just disappeared, instead of being places where you could reform people and put them back out into society, okay? The big ones, though, that I would focus on, of course, are the abolitionist movement, right? Slavery is becoming more of an issue in the 1830s and 40s. People are focusing on that. Of course, you have your famous abolitionists, guys like William Lloyd Garrison with his newspaper, The Liberator, guys like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. You could throw Harriet Tubman in there as well. Famous abolitionists who are working against slavery. All right, remember this abolitionist movement will start to take hold in the North, although many Northerners did see the abolitionist movement as sort of an annoyance, basically saying slavery doesn't exist here anyway. Why are you here preaching anti-slavery? You need to go somewhere else with that message. And what they really meant was go to the South with it. But of course, that message is not going to take hold in the South because Southerners are going to hold so tightly to slavery because they believe it's the basis of their economy. But that abolitionist movement we know is going to pick up steam as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. Okay. The other big one in here, the last bullet point that I have for you guys in this section was the women's rights movement, and more specifically that Seneca Falls Convention. Remember, this is going to be 1849, where famous women's rights activists, people like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these women are going to not only promote women's rights. Remember, this did spawn off of the abolitionist movement as a side note, right? That's when women realized that they needed to focus more on their rights as well. But what they're going to do at this Seneca Falls Convention is they are going to create what is known as the Declaration of Sentiments, a very significant document when you're talking about women's rights in U.S. history. And the Declaration of Sentiments is basically taking a lot of the concepts and the actual wording that appeared in the Declaration of Independence and modifying it to include that phrase, and women, right? So in the past where it said all men are created equal, these women added in there all men and women are created equal. And they started sort of adding in these phrases, the same phrases that had been used in the Declaration of Independence, but adding that phrase "and women." And really what they're focusing on for this women's rights movement in the Seneca Falls Convention, their number one goal is women's suffrage, the right to vote. Because what women realize is you're never truly going to be equal, truly going to be viewed as the same as men until you have the same political rights. And the right to vote is going to be number one on the list. If you have no voice in your government, then you will not be protected by your government, and you cannot be seen as equal within that government. Okay? Those are sort of the big topics from the Age of Reforms during the Jacksonian period. Remember, this is a time period of the common man. That's a phrase that they like to use, the time period of the common man. And those are some of the big reforms. And again, I would not be surprised at all if that ends up being possibly the topic of your DBQ essay. Finally, though, we jump into Unit 5, and this is our last page for the week, page 15. Unit 5, at least the start of it, focuses on manifest destiny, okay? And we're going to I'm just going to throw these ideas out at you, right? Some of the steps in manifest destiny. And I want you guys to sort of have your examples, because again, it would not surprise me at all if manifest destiny is the concept behind your DBQ essay. Territorial expansion, okay? Manifest destiny is the idea that the United States was supposed to expand across North America, right? That it was meant to be. And the person that coined that phrase was John L. O'Sullivan. And John L. O'Sullivan basically gave his reasoning behind manifest destiny. He said, number one, God intended it to happen. He's a religious man, and he believed in destiny and those concepts, that God wanted this. He wanted the United States to expand across North America. And that sort of leads to number two. The reason he believed that is because he believed that America stood for what was good. Phrases like freedom, equality, independence, justice, right? Democracy. He believed that by expanding across North America, we, the United States, would have the ability to spread those most important principles associated with humans and government, and that it was our responsibility to do that. The third reason was a much more simple reason, much more common sense reason, and that was that we needed to expand because our population was growing, and more land would be needed to fit this growing population. All right? If you wanted to start tracking the land gains, and this might be good to do for like outside information if you did get a DBQ essay on manifest destiny, have examples of territorial gains. I think you have to start with the Louisiana Purchase under Thomas Jefferson. You know, while the phrase manifest destiny wasn't coined until we get more into like the late 1830s, 1840s, so long after the Louisiana Purchase, I think you have to look at that land acquisition as really your first major land gain, first territorial expansion in U.S. history. Once you get past the Louisiana Purchase, I think you're looking at probably the Adams-Onis Treaty. Remember, Adams-Onis Treaty is what's going to gain us that Florida. And then you're starting to get into some later land gains. Webster-Ashburton Treaty, you might want to throw that one in there. Remember, that's the one that defined our northern border with Canada, between Maine and Canada and the Great Lakes region in Canada. You might want to talk about the Oregon Territory. Remember, it's during the 1840s that we have that famous 54-40 or fight, that famous campaign slogan associated with Manifest Destiny, that we wanted all of the Oregon Territory. You're going to have the annexation of Texas. Remember, after the Texas Revolution, they wanted to be annexed, but the U.S. Congress said no, and Texas remained independent for almost 10 years. But finally, the U.S. annexes Texas, and that would be another land gain. But the really big one when you're talking about manifest destiny is going to be the Mexican-American War, okay? And when you're talking about the Mexican-American War, it starts with the annexation of Texas. Remember, we sort of knew that this war would probably happen once the United States annexed Texas. This conflict, as far as details of the actual war, it's probably not something that you need to focus on. What you need to know is that at the end of the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this treaty is what will give the United States this big chunk of land in what is now the American Southwest, known as the Mexican Cession. Okay, and the Mexican Cession includes states like New Mexico and Arizona and the southern portion of California and Nevada, and big chunk of land in the American Southwest. With this, though, this major land gain, and really the last piece of the puzzle when you're talking about manifest destiny, remember the Gadsden Purchase is that little piece of land under New Mexico that comes right at the end of manifest destiny. But if you're talking about like the final piece of the puzzle, the Mexican Cession was huge, getting that entire southwestern region. But the last thing I want you guys to remember is that as territorial expansion takes place, whether you're talking about all the way back with the Louisiana Purchase or all the way to the Mexican Cession, there will be major debates that are happening. All right, and just to give you guys a handful of them. As the country expands, debates over what should happen to Native Americans. Remember, as we expand, we're coming into greater contact with Native American tribes. What should be the relationship with Native Americans? What should our policy be towards them? And of course, we've already talked about Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy and the Trail of Tears. And so this is a debate. Some people say, oh, we shouldn't do this. And some people say, well, you know, America is supposed to be a land for white men and for the government. And, you know, these are the debates we're talking about. Another big debate that comes with territorial expansion is, of course, going to be slavery. And that's really the biggest one, you know. As the country expands, issues over where slavery should exist and where it shouldn't will start to pop up. And that's where we see some of those big compromises. Missouri Compromise came first, but then you'll see the Compromise of 1850. Eventually, you'll see the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I mean, these are major compromises that the U.S. government tried to take in dealing with territorial expansion associated with the debate over slavery. Remember as well that as the country expands and as the concepts of slavery expand, sectionalism will increase at this time too. So you have sectionalism starting to brew here as well. Remember, the big reason that we didn't annex Texas, one of the most important reasons we didn't annex Texas initially, was because we didn't want to answer those questions about the growth of slavery. So the debate over slavery and the compromises made in regards to territorial expansion and slavery is a huge piece of this story when you're talking about manifest destiny. Okay? Hopefully that helps you guys to finish your notes for this week. Next week, we're going to jump into the rest of Unit 5, and that's where we're going to start moving towards the Civil War. So we're going to talk more about sectionalism and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then finally, in Unit 6 is where we're going to talk about westward expansion after the whole manifest destiny thing is sort of done with, but also get into the Gilded Age. And then finally start to creep right around the 1900s as we get towards the end of next week and the beginning of the following week, right before the exam. Okay. Don't forget, I did post your DBQ practice essay for this week. Make sure you guys get on that. Find yourself 45 minutes to be totally dedicated to doing that essay the right way. Open it up, set your timers for 45 minutes and go. And then wherever your timer goes off, send me that file. Let me give you guys some feedback on that. Other than that, guys, that's all I have for you. I do have some important information about the AP exam as far as how to log in and doing some practice with that kind of stuff. But I'm going to give you guys more of that information next week. Okay? I hope you guys are all doing well. Hang in there. We're only looking at 2 weeks left, 2 weeks from tomorrow for the AP exam. So if you guys can really buckle down and give 2 really good weeks, you're going to put yourself in a really good spot. All right? Hang in there. And if you guys have any questions or anything like that, make sure that you send me a chat or an email, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. All right, we'll see you guys soon.